Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Snyder. I've been advising dentists for over 30 plus years in transition related matters. And I joined Henry Schein's dental practice transitions group in 2010 as a senior director. I'm going to be your moderator today. And I look forward to this program with two of my colleagues. First of all, Greg Auerbach has over 20 years of experience as a dental broker and practice valuator, and he has been one of our leading brokers for the past several years. Greg is also a member of our senior management team. Chris Rainier began his career in the dental industry as an equipment specialist with Henry Schein Dental. He then joined our group as a broker and recently was promoted to the position of regional sales manager for our group. A couple of housekeeping items I just want to mention before we get started. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A section. And also, continuing education credit is not available. So today we're going to cover several case studies based on various practice transition issues and how that information may apply to your current transition situation, or at least provide you with some food for thought with your overall transition planning. Now, Greg will begin our webinar with a case study regarding a solo practitioner's experience in selling his practice. It's all yours, Greg.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for that great introduction. Let's get right in because we've got a lot to talk about today. So this first case study that we're talking about is a solo owner-operator of a general practice, and it was located in an urban and mostly desirable area, very accessible location, nice access to patient base, and ultimately it was grossing about $1.2 million overall. The seller marketed his practice. They decided to sell it on his own and marketed and classified for about $1.4 million, claiming an EBITDA, which we'll come back to in a few minutes, of $350,000 and a 4x multiple. And in talking to the seller, they said, well, we priced it that way because we read in a journal that that was reasonable. Ultimately, this practice was viewed by many, but it did not sell as it was offered, which is why we were involved. So in taking a look and what was going on, it's very, very important in these cases and in the situation of especially setting a selling price is to understand and interpret financials. Pricing and cash flow leads to value, which leads to pricing. And so understanding how that works is imperative in getting to pricing. Beyond that, though, the valuation methodologies and how you actually walk through establishing value from the financials is also important. So it's a dual component of this conversation. And at the end of the day, also knowing what available capital was and the purchaser pool, which also was a detriment to this practice situation. So ultimately, when we finally took the practice over, we came in and we did a formal practice evaluation and we completed it. We saw an EBITDA closer to $105,000, and the pricing was reset then with our evaluation to structure for a private sale. And in that, we had net after debt somewhere around $276,000. With all of that structured and it properly marketed and packaged, we had multiple inquiries. We had others, though, in that pool saying that they'd already seen the practice. They were not interested because they thought that the seller or felt that the seller was overpricing the practice. At the end of the day, we were able to sell the practice, at asking price, and that was closer to the $1 million. That was the $1 million that we evaluated, and we had gone through the process of reviewing financials and actually evaluating to get there. It was priced to the market, and we had purchasers available to take that over. So even though part of that market ended up being a little bit spoiled because they felt that that seller had already gone to market and had an unrealistic expectation on pricing, we were able to secure a quality purchaser and get that transitioned. So Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about practice valuations themselves?
Sure. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been doing these for many, many years and seeing just about everything in valuations as well. I know Greg has this too. So let's talk about ask you some key questions and I'll give you some answers. First question, why your classmate in another part of the country got a higher value than you despite the fact that you both had very similar practices, such as gross receipts, practice facility, similarity, and operating overhead. Why is there a difference? Well, you're probably not surprised to hear this, but it's a known fact that practice values do vary across the country. And it's really about a simple economic characteristic called supply and demand. In markets where you've got lots of purchasers and not so many sellers, you're going to have a situation where there's a lot of demand for a practice or practices. Consequently, the values in those markets are a lot higher. And where we really see this is in most urban and suburban areas. Conversely, if you're in a rural area, small town environment where it's very difficult, if almost impossible sometimes, to find another doctor, you can readily understand why the demand isn't high. So consequently, the values in those markets are going to be lower, considerably so, than in the urban and the suburban markets. Okay, go to the next one. Why do EBIT evaluations usually provide a higher value than the majority of valuations that are prepared using common industry methods? Well, we have found that EBIT evaluations typically are done on larger practices. And of course, we all know the last 15 to 20 years, corporate dentistry's been in our market and continues to be there and will continue to grow. And that's the methodology they use. But they like to target larger practices because there's usually greater economies of scale and typically a higher net profit, more cash flow, and they're able to provide higher values. Conversely, when we look at what we call the private sale market, where we have a doctor or doctors who want to sell, and they come to someone like us who will value the practice, we use common industry methodology. But the constraint that we have in the market is not unlimited capital like we may have in a corporate environment, but we have professional lenders, dental lenders, who will put a ceiling on what they're willing to loan for a cash buyout of a practice. So consequently, we find typically those values are lower than they are in the EBITDA world. Okay, the next question. This is a good one. Why do valuations consider prior and recent performance rather than potential? We've heard the story from many of our doctors. Well, I've got so many things we can do. There's so much treatment in the records. Really, it's a gold mine. Well, it's only a gold mine until it's at least been mined. And what we find is that when you're trying to value a potential, you're not going to really find anyone who's willing to do that. All valuators are going to look at prior performance. We typically look at 4 years of performance, tax returns and financial statements. As do banks, they like to look at least the last 2, maybe 3 years. And in the corporate world, they're looking at the prior 12 months. They call it TTM, trailing 12 months. So it's all about what has the practice done, particularly recently. As a matter of fact, where banks get very nervous when they're lending, if they see any kind of blip in performance recently, they get a little nervous in their underwriting department. And so they question the doctor on whether or not there's some issues going on. So the bottom line is you can't really sell on potential. It's like someone who's trying to sell a house and say, well, we're putting in a new kitchen and a new roof. It's worth a lot more. Well, you're not going to pay for that, are you? Okay, we'll go to the next one. Why is new technology and equipment not the primary contributor to high practice value? Well, the simple fact is it certainly does contribute to a higher value as compared to someone who has older or outdated equipment. But at the end of the day, what produces the net income? The operator is the manager of the business. And basically, that's what people are interested when they're buying a practice. What is the cash flow? What's the net income of the practice? Yes, new equipment and technology is important. But frankly, new equipment and technology by themselves don't generate an increase in profit. It's the people using that equipment. And we have seen instances where doctors bought equipment and never really used it to the fullest capability, and consequently didn't improve the net. As a matter of fact, the DSOs, when they do evaluation using EBITDA, they look at equipment, but they don't even factor it in to their calculus like most conventional evaluators do, who consider the market value of equipment. So again, it's definitely important. But conversely, if you have older equipment, outdated technology, you can expect a premium price. Why? Because the buyer is probably going to have to make an investment. In addition to what he's going to pay you, he has to borrow more money to upgrade technology or add new equipment. So hence, you get a lower price. Okay, next question. What are some key tactics to enhance practice value? Well, there's several that we'll just address. There's a lot, but maybe some of the key ones are on the revenue side. When was the last time you looked at your fee schedule? And is it competitive? Have you looked at comparative situations, databases, and others? There are some services that can help you look at these types of things. That's one. Number two, if you have a lot of PPOs, I'm sure that they're not all performing as well as you'd like. You should take a look at those PPOs and decide if there's some underperforming ones and maybe make some changes. Also, what about your service mix? Looking at your clinical production. Are there some things that maybe you used to do and no longer do and now are referring out? And if they were retained in the practice, that certainly could enhance revenue and hopefully profit. And on the profit side, taking a look at your practice statistics. For example, your overhead, especially staff salaries. What are they being paid? What kind of fringe benefits are you offering? Are you overstaffed? So those are some key things that you should look at as an initial way. And finally, looking at some of your management systems. Clearly, if you have a collection problem, maybe you have to look at how well you collect, how well you're processing your claims, even though they're being electronically filed, or there's some inefficiencies there. And basically, if you're a general practitioner, one of the things most management consultants look at is the recare program, and can those areas be enhanced? So those are just a few of the many things that could be done. All right, the next question. How long does it take to prepare a practice valuation? Well, it really is dependent on the cooperation we get from our clients. Most valuators do require a lot of information, 3 to 4 years tax returns, production reports. Sometimes if there's a lease issue, that's included as well. There's a questionnaire that needs to be completed. So many doctors, when we get engaged to do evaluation, don't give us all the information up front. It takes time, and we have to constantly go out and get that information. So from a standpoint of an analyst doing evaluation, it's several hours to do it, but getting the data is the biggest challenge that we face in any practice valuation, just because we're trying to do a thorough job, but we need our clients' cooperation in getting the data that is required to make it work for us. So those are some of the questions that I wanted to address with you all today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Greg for our next case study.
Yes, let's talk about another one. This is an established family practice, and we called it established family practice ready to go, or ready to grow, I'm sorry, but go also, because it was really a nice opportunity. Again, a desirable city. It was 3 operatories, about 1,600 square feet, and located behind a large established area hospital. So a very stable part of the town. Again, very accessible to residential areas of the city. The equipment was probably around 10 years old on average, some older, some newer. Restorative Crown and Bridge office, not a lot of specialty work going on. A lot of things were being referred out of the practice, and it was completely fee-for-service. So there was no in-network or discounted insurance plans, with last year's collections in the low 400s. So very, very accessible, stable, family practice, and again, ready to grow. This case, though, is interesting because although the stability of the area was there, the hospital had control of the building. And the hospital stated that the practice was not going to get a lease renewal. And the seller knew that walking into the initial meeting and brought that up front. And we had a conversation with the seller to say, well, we're going to have to find somewhere. If the hospital as a landlord is not going to lease to a new practitioner and keep the practice here for a long period of time, then financing won't be available. And in that case, if it's not available, we are going to have to move the practice. So in this case, we did actually pick up the practice and move it to a nearby space. Fortunately, it was available. But this brings into a lot of conversation, leases. And, one of those components of a transition itself, one of those big things that we bring up, both in what we ask for up front and throughout the process, is the examination and understanding of exactly what's in the lease. So for those of you who are renting, please immediately take out that lease. And it could be a couple of pages, it could be 70, 80, 90 pages. But review your current lease. If you're looking at a new lease, please look very closely at that. And please even suggest that you get advisors involved between attorneys and lease experts to help you navigate this lease, especially those that are longer. Now, longer in length by number of pages, and therefore more complex. We've brought up a lot that, hey, my lease is assignable, and that's great. It's helpful. It's good to know that language is in there because that typically means the landlord is looking to keep the facility as a dental facility. But it's not make or break for us. In a lot of cases, where you are with your lease likely will mean that we will have to obtain either a new one or an extension to the assignment as it is. And there are cases where an attorney might say that the assignment is not what you want to do as the previous seller or the previous owner and seller anyway, due to liability reasons. So there are things to talk about on a legal level there. So the assignability factor, it's nice, but it's not necessary. But the availability, just as we talked about before, is paramount. We have to have the availability to secure a new lease. So while you're looking over that lease, though, check for fees. These were hidden. You may have signed the lease and you didn't even realize they were there, but there potentially are lease termination fees. So you saying, look, I'm going to leave and you're going to have to pay a fee. There could be a fee for you to assign the lease. There could be a fee for you to ask to assign the lease. We have seen that before. There's also potential of fees for transferring the space in some other way or even subleasing it in some other way. So go look for all of those fees. There are also cases where we found, and this derailed a potential transition, was the minimal financial net worth of a successor tenant. There are cases, especially in larger complexes, where the landlord is a bigger corporation and they say, we want the net worth of a successor tenant to be X. And it's typically millions of dollars. And in a lot of cases, a new purchaser, especially purchasers that are looking to buy private practices, they don't have that net worth and therefore they would never qualify. So check for that. And if it's in there, then it's certainly something to have an attorney, a lease expert come in to help you with, and potentially us to give you some feedback on to try to figure out how to resolve that. The other big thing to look for in your lease is a due on sale clause. And these are clauses that have nothing to do with the space itself, but it has to do with your sale of your practice. And we've seen cases where a due on sale clause was in the lease and it was requiring the selling owner to pay the landlord up to 75% of the sales price, citing that the value of the practice was inextricably tied to the location. So the fact that the practice was able to use that location was the benefit of the practice, and therefore the landlord should benefit in the sale. And so those due on sale clauses are definitely valid. They're definitely in there in a number of leases. So if you have, especially, again, longer leases with more complex clauses in them, take a very, very close look and look for those due on sale clauses. But again, any of these other fees, because they can add up and they can add up quickly. And it could be something that at this moment you don't even know. So please, 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 if you're leasing, take out your current leases. If you're looking at a new lease, please take those out. Please look at them much more closely than you may have prior to this webinar. We really want you to be able to be in the best position to transition and keep as much money in your pocket as possible.
Great advice there, Greg, that's for sure. Now, Chris, you're on deck and you're going to talk about associate anxiety.
Thank you, Tom. This particular practice was doing $3.5 million in collections. It was a two associate dental practice, meaning owner and an associate. In a well-established city, 9 operatories, a fantastic staff that was there for years. And it was doing a lot of revenue. It was doing $3.5 million. Now, the context of the relationship between the associate and the owner was, over time, they were going to, eventually he was going to sell his practice to the associate. However, years went by and it kept getting pushed every year, maybe next year. Eventually, the owner decided to say, okay, let me do a valuation, told the associate he was working on it. And as Tom was saying before, the information was very slow to get, right? So they weren't able to do the valuation. And the associate got restless and elected to go look for another practice. Luckily for him, he found a practice in the same town. Not good for the owner, because the owner never had him sign a restrictive covenant. What does that mean? That associate could go down the street and work without any legal recourse, and the owner of the dental practice that he worked at now has a practice that has revenue that's tied to him that is nearly impossible to figure out how much the one's going to take down from going down the street. And it created a challenging situation for us to sell this practice. Greg, can you walk us through how we were able to address this situation and what was the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of questions that actually came up in this process from purchasers, because, I mean, we had a situation where the associate was leaving and it left the seller kind of in lurch, because a $3.5 million office is not a single practitioner practice. And so with this other practitioner leaving on very, very short notice, again, put our seller, in this case, in a position where we didn't know what to do. And so purchasers' questions we're looking at first, well, what's going to happen with this attrition? Where is it going to go? How is it going to be shored up? In conjunction with that was just, again, that size of the practice. Where is this production going to get done? And then when we step back further, again, how is the financing going to come? How are we going to justify a price and justify financing to make sure that the practice would support that? So what we ended up doing is we look closely at kind of what each practitioner was doing. We had a little bit of time to see how patient records were leaving the office, and fortunately they weren't leaving as quickly as we feared. So we were able to put together a structure where we had kind of a baseline practice, lower level, which had to do with the owner practitioner, basically their portion of the practice as a baseline. And then we were able to put an earnout on the balance of what was left over and say, well, whatever stays here was added value, and it was retained by the practice, and therefore the attrition was lessened, and we should be able to quantify that as a value. Clearly, it wasn't something that we were able to set on day one at the point of sale, because we didn't know, but we were able to structure it so that we would be able to turn around. Now, the price at the end of the day was significantly discounted. I mean, this was not something that we would have normally, it was not at the level we would normally have gotten, unfortunately. But it was more than nothing. It was still actually a very strong acquisition price for the situation, but there were a lot of factors that played into really shoring this up, including how fast we were able to move. We were able to find a purchaser quite quickly. The seller's reputation in the area was very strong, but having an associate and having this situation of not having a non-compete in place, and in some cases, Tom and Chris, we've all seen this, where there isn't even a written agreement in place at all, let alone just not having a non-compete. It is vital to value and vital to a transition to have those in place. I think Tom, it might be good to spend a couple of minutes just talking through non-compete, if you think.
Sure. Okay. Well, first and foremost, associates should have professionally written contracts. And it's not just to protect the owner, but it's also to really protect the associate. Why? Well, you have to really recite your expectations. For example, how many hours a week are you working? Are there going to be emergency responsibilities on weekends or evenings? And is it alternating? Should all be spelled out clearly so everyone knows what's going on. If, as a matter of fact, in some agreements I've seen the responsibility for them to be at a morning huddle or to be at monthly staff meetings. It's not mandatory, but those are things that I've seen. But more importantly for the associate, what's their compensation? Is there a formula? Is it clearly stated? Are there going to be any adjustments or deductions for lab or other clinically related supplies, whether it be for ortho, implants, etc.? What about fringe benefits? And what are they? Are they entitled? And of course, what about a bonus program? And that should be clearly stated. Now, getting to the non-compete part of it, it's important to have these in your agreement. And most importantly, they have to be enforceable. By that, I mean, if you're in a urban area where there's lots of people and lots of dentists, having a 15-mile covenant in an area where there may be hundreds of dentists probably is not going to be enforceable. Or conversely, if you have an associate who's only an employee, but they have a non-compete, and you have a 5-year timeline on them, in most jurisdictions, probably that's going to be challenged. It has to be reasonable. So the reasonableness has to be geography and time. Now, what we have seen in many agreements is a lack of non-solicitation language. Patience, most everybody has, but where people really omit some very important language, that's for your staff. And we know how difficult it is to hire good staff. There's a shortage of staff members, especially hygienists and dental assistants in many, many areas. So consequently, if you lose a key hygienist, for example, they're taken by your former employee, well, that could be a real problem. And typically, they have an initial grace period of 30 to 90 days upon hire to take force. So, reasonableness is what I mentioned before, should be very much included in these agreements. They have to be reasonable. And there are parts of the country that maybe enforceability or applicability may be questionable, but yet most attorneys will still put in non-compete language. And quite frankly, from a buyer's point of view, they like to see it anyway. It gives them a sense of comfort because even if jurisdictions were to change in the future about enforceability, the fact that it was in there is better than it not being in there. But finally, one other item I want to mention, this called merger and integration clause. What that simply means is you could have a non-compete, non-solicitation agreement in your contract. But if you don't have this clause, what this means is as follows. I own the practice. I have a covenant on you. I sell my practice to a third party. I no longer am there. I'm retired. So is the covenant and non-solicitation. That goes with me, the former owner. So what a merger and integration clause simply states is whatever was in force in the original agreement is being transferred in the case of a sale. So that's a very important item to have. And we have seen cases where this clause was missing, even though they had a non-compete. But the seller lost considerable dollars because a very shrewd attorney picked that up and said, not good enough for us. We're going to really lower the purchase price.
Tom, can I ask a question about that? Because a lot of times we sit down with clients and they say, I ask them, I say, hey, you don't have restricted covenants for your employees, your associates. And they say, oh, no, they're really not enforceable in my area. What do you say to that?
Well, I say that they may not be enforceable, but they should at least be in there because it's a deterrent. It really is. I mean, if from a legal point of view, if it's not enforceable, it's not enforceable. But as I think I said a minute ago, a buyer would like to see it in there just to give them sense of comfort. And some lenders may even want to see the language in there for all I know, even though it may not be enforceable in that particular market. And of course, nothing is forever. And what if we have a long-term deal and legislation changes and they are now valid? And if they're not in there, that's a major omission. Okay. Well, now I'm going to call Greg back, and he's going to be talking about partnership peril.
Yeah, we get a lot of requests and say, I really want to be an associate, and then I really want to be a partner. And it's feeling that multiple doctors in a practice kind of makes things easier. And in reality, I think on our transition side, we would say that it generally makes things more complicated. So let's look at a situation where we had a couple of doctors who were actually longtime friends. They were dental school classmates, and they decided, they were living in the same area, so they wanted to put a practice together on their own. They leased a facility, and it was of sufficient size to support both practitioners. They set up a jointly owned corporation and marketed and promoted this practice as Sunnyside Smiles. They operated similar full-time schedules with shared office resources, so the staff, equipment, the practice management software, everything was shared. Everything was under the corporation. Again, they were long-term friends. So, really, what could go wrong? Unfortunately, that's where we live, is what could go wrong. And in this case, the problem is that all partnerships do break up. Now, I say this often, partnerships can break up for good reasons. They can break up for bad reasons. There could be hugely great news about a new job opportunity for a spouse, or the kids get into a school in a different part of the country and one partner needs to relocate and therefore leave the partnership. But again, there could be just situations where there are problems in the practice and the two parties no longer get along, and therefore the partnership needs to break up. So in this case, partner one actually locked partner two out of the space. And in doing that, they completely changed the lock. There was no access to partner two after this weekend away. They came back on Monday morning. They could not get it. So at that point, essentially, partner two had no practice whatsoever. I say often, it's very easy to get you into a partnership. I could do it on the back of a cocktail napkin. The problem is what do I do about getting you out when the case comes that we need to? And again, and this is one of those situations that wasn't addressed. That's why partnership agreements are of significant length, because we try to deal with everything that may be out there. And if there were clauses in their agreement, they didn't have one. If there are clauses in their agreement to actually get them out of this partnership, then this may not have come to it. So what ended up happening is the second partner lost their entire practice. Part of the reason they lost it was not just because the doors were locked, but because they had no second phone number, no second marketing tool, and just no real support around them to even get to those charts. The charts were not of their specific custody. They were of the practices overall. So they had really no access to anything. So at the point that they could go down the street and reopen in a new location, which again, it took time because there wasn't just a location available for them to do so, but there was no ability for the patient to actually go find the practitioner because there was no phone number. The voicemail left on the old practice's phone line just said nothing about partner two at all. It was like they vanished off the face of the earth. So this is a real situation. This actually happened. This can happen, and why we implore you to be careful if you're walking into a partnership. So our biggest solutions, the biggest takeaway from this, first, have documentation. In this case, again, they had no documentation, but better define partnership documentation. And again, that's lengthy. And a big component of that is not getting you in, not the structure itself, but what happens when there's a problem. There are ancillary documents that go along with the partnership document that talk about how you make decisions in a practice. Those are generally called an operating agreement. And that will help facilitate so that hopefully there aren't issues between the partners. But having those that better defined set of documentation is a good start. There are other ways to do this. Also, we don't have to go into the traditional partnership model. There are corporate entity ownership with separate resource models that we can put together, whereby essentially you're in a space sharing operation where the two entities are owning their own assets, they're owning their own practice, they take care of their own practice records, even their own phone numbers, and they're operating in the same space. This is actually the most efficient way to practice because you are sharing a number of expenses that are not duplicated when you have a solo practice. And it's just a bit more efficient than practicing on your own. So in these cases, outside of a straight partnership where two of you are have equal ownership in a similar corporation, having your own separate entities with your own separate assets gives us a couple of things. One, it gives you autonomy, which a lot of practitioners like. You like to make your own decisions. Perhaps you want to go in one direction with your practice and your partner doesn't, but you can do that because you have your own practice and you have your own patient base. And that could be whether it be marketing or just getting into specialty work, or say you want to buy a new piece of technology and your partner doesn't. You can do that in your own practice. The biggest thing for us as transition specialists is looking at it to say, look, if there is a challenge, we have the opportunity to take your practices apart, put them in two separate locations, and everybody can continue to operate as if nothing happened. There are some cases where a building is shared, where we've designed the building such that you could put a wall down the middle and separate the two practices if necessary. There are other cases where that already existed, or we know that we could move one of the two practices, perhaps at some sort of cost to the other practice, to a new location so that everyone can continue operating. There are a lot of ways to form a partnership. Again, partnerships are very easy to get into. It's how we deal with getting you out of them. And the more work that we can do in structuring the inbound helps us with the outbound. And at the end of the day, everybody wants this to be smooth. Even if the two partners are not seeing eye to eye, we want everyone to be out in an amicable situation. And so what we're looking at, like I started with, we look at the pretty bad situation, but in doing that, we're trying to find the best way out, the smoothest way out, and the best way for everybody to continue to exist. And so there are a lot of ways to do this. It just takes the proper planning to get there.
Great advice, Greg. Thanks so much. Now, Chris, back to you and talk about next case study on insurance investigation.
Great. Next slide. So this was a 5 treatment room practice. Collections are about $1.5 million. Really nice area in a major metro community. Equipment was about 8 years old. It was kind of renovated recently. Equipment was, relatively good. The procedure mix, anybody can do it. And it was very attractive to purchasers. Now, when the seller of this practice went to market, they elected not to hire a broker, and they found a buyer, and they had told them, hey, listen, you're my collections, here's the information. And one of the things they told them was, well, we have 80% managed in-network insurance, which everybody loves, but there's 20% government health programs, right, which has very low reimbursements in the area. And that was the context of the deal, right? They made an aggressive offer. They agreed to it. Rather than going to a letter of intent, which we always recommend, and setting the parameters of how the steps would be taking place, they just went to contracts. They hired 2 attorneys. They negotiated for months. They negotiated everything. And then at the end, the buyer's like, hey, by the way, I like to do due diligence now, even though it was later than we would have recommended, but they didn't know what they were doing because neither party had bought or sold the practice before. And they realized after they had somebody from their team go into the practice management software, they found out that it was more of not 20% government-backed programs, it was more of 50%. And that's a big challenge for a lot of buyers. Number one, they feel like they were lied to and misled. And number two is it's not what they were looking for. They were thinking 80% high-paying insurances, and they were getting something significantly different. So this particular buyer elected to not move forward with it and then came to us and purchased another practice somewhere else. They wasted a ton of money and a ton of time for both parties because the process wasn't done right and it was some misinformation. So some key takeaways about this particular practice is, one of the things is you must try to understand your insurance breakdowns. And it's a conversation that I have a lot with sellers. They think, in many cases, not because they're trying to mislead me, is they have a certain mindset of, oh, this is what I take. I only take the best insurances. I don't take a lot of that, because they're not into the day-to-day operations of it. And they don't realize that over time, their practice may have changed, and they're not the ones that are actually checking the paperwork. They're just looking at their bottom line. So it's so important to understand the insurance breakdowns you're taking every single year. If you don't, you're going to have challenges in the future. You also want to make sure that your fees are in line with the market. Many times we sit down with doctors, we get their fee schedules, and we send them to potential buyers, and they look at them and they go, wow, these fees are terrible. I get paid a lot more at the associateship that I'm in right now from these insurances. The sellers have not done their homework and negotiated with the insurance companies to increase their fees, or at least keep them in the market rates in that area. Or maybe in some cases, maybe they need to drop of insurance just because it's gotten significantly lower than they signed up for 20 years ago. So those are the key takeaways of this practice. And also just remember that if you don't follow the right process and you don't go into a letter of intent and set up the parameters of how you're going to do diligence and how you're going to make sure that the buyer can get funding, you may be spending money on lawyers and time, significant amount of time and money in that situation that could really impact your business. Greg, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, this is a huge issue. Now, it's very difficult to find out what mix of what insurance is in a practice. And I think we acknowledge that. And typically when I'm talking to a seller, I would rather have them and have you estimate on the side of more over less, because everybody would always like to find less if we wouldn't find more. We do have methodology and ways to step through and go piece by piece to try to figure out exactly what's in a practice. But again, it's quite difficult. So we acknowledge that up front. But I mean, it's very important both on a purchaser level, a lender level, and just understanding where the practice is going forward, where the different insurance plans break out. So while we might ask you to estimate essentially on the higher side of insurance versus no insurance, and it will take some work, and we want to try to get it as right as possible because it's very important.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do recommend many of my sellers do, and anybody that owns a practice, is keep the government issued payments from those insurances. A lot of times they're just thrown out because your tax accountant doesn't need them, but every insurance will be sent from the government a form that shows exactly how much money you got from every single insurance company.
I would actually add also, Chris, we have great resources, and there are resources out there to help manage all sorts of insurances in a practice. And so, employing those early on and getting a practice set in a really quality place of understanding what insurance is in there, and potentially divesting a bunch of insurances or at least consolidating insurance plans can be hugely beneficial. I mean, there are some times that you think that you have a very quality, high reimbursement rate insurance plan, and when you really get down to it, they aren't paying you almost anything. And it's a net loss to the practice to actually take that plan. But you wouldn't know that unless you went through the exercise of really investigating what's there and what's not. And the other thing is, you might find that you have plans that just don't have patients on them. So why are you participating in them? Just get out and just try to streamline and consolidate the practice. One of those things that we talk about when we talk about valuations are the practice systems and how the practice operates, and the streamlinedness, the easiness, the cleanliness makes it easier to transact. It's easier to take over. It's easier to keep that business operating as it was operating, and therefore value is strengthened and pricing is typically higher for that kind of practice, which is why a lot of times we'll see, I mean, most often a fee-for-service practice will sell for more than a comparable PPO office because it's less patients to produce the same amount of money, and really just less complexity in the practice overall. How many fee schedules do you have? One, as opposed to an insurance-laden practice where I've seen them have potentially up to 100 different fee schedules in a practice. And complexity just brings uncertainty, and uncertainty lessens value and lessens pricing.
Great. Okay. Greg is going to finish up our case studies today with a very timely topic, as more and more practitioners today are considering multiple locations. Take it away, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we get a lot of questions about, and especially as I'm speaking throughout the country, a doctor will come up and say, look, I want to have a second location, or I want a third location. I want to continue to grow. And we talk to purchasers who are very excited, even when they're buying their first one, that they're going to have multiple practices. So in this case, we're looking at a 2 locations, so we're keeping it a little bit simple. It's a 2-location practice with the 2 locations roughly 7 miles apart. Collections overall, just over $1 million at 1.1. They were using a cloud-based software, and the justification was, look, we can access it anywhere, so it's a great solution for our practice overall. The seller says that they want to slow down. They want to spend more time with family. Their kids are getting a little bit older. They also cited, look, it's complex to run more than one location. I mean, one location can be complex on its own, let alone running 2. But also just a desire to focus and develop their skills and really just hone in and get that single location going better. So they really start saying, look, we wanted to best one of our 2 locations. So the problem that was presented in this case, and this happens a lot, which is why we're bringing it up, is this 2-location office was actually running under 1 tax return. So there was 1 corporate name for the entirety of the 2 locations. We had 1 staff, we had 1 patient base, and so effectively we had 1 practice. As we've talked about before, between phone numbers, between marketing, this practice is operating as if it was a single location. It just happened to be operating on a 2. And in that case, it might have been operating a little inefficiently because we were doubling facility costs for the 1 practice operation overall. So this is really not ideal for us, especially in a case where we're looking at, again, a worst case scenario of, well, what happens if you need to divest one of those locations? So our ultimate solution, and really just comes down to planning, which we talked about a lot. The earlier we can have conversations, the better we can put you into position to be able to transition later. But our solution in this case would be to actually break the 2 locations apart. Ideally, we would have set them up as 2 locations in the first place. But for any location that you have, any time that you're going to add locations to your practice, our ideal is that we have a separate tax return and separate set of financials for every single location. So I can say to you, I need practice 3, and you can give me a set of clean books for just that practice. In that, I'd also like a separate patient base. I'd like a separate staff. I'd like a separate telephone number. I think out of those, the separate staff is probably the hardest because, again, we're going to start duplicating costs. And so there are cases where we could see that a staff might migrate between practices. But the first thing that we're going to say to you, and I said to this practitioner in the case of having the staff that roamed between the 2 practices, was, who are you going to leave behind? And if you're not going to leave behind someone permanently, we're going to need to leave someone behind for 6 months or so, or I need you to go today and hire a second hygienist and a second front desk in particular, so that there can be continuity in the office. In most cases, purchasers are going to walk in and have 0 staff. They're going to walk in with 0 besides their skill and desire to grow. If they have no staff there to support them, if they have no continuity from the old practice to the new practice, the patients are gone. They have no ability to hire the team to host them and be able to take care and provide that clinical care. And so while I can potentially get by without a separate staff, I'm going to need some of that staff to stay behind in transition, and it typically could be for an extended period of time, up to 6 to 9 months, where we're sharing staff between a couple of locations. Separate telephone numbers, again, is almost imperative. I have to have that so we can separate where those patients are calling to. I'd like separate systems, or at least in the system that you have as far as practice management software goes, that we are able to clearly delineate which patients are which. And again, every expense that we can have separated on our financial statement and the tax return is vital to being able to present one practice versus the other. Now, one thing I will tell you, is that in the cases, there are many cases where you might get a request for both sets of financials, even though we're only evaluating the one. That's important to, again, to understand where practice expenses are, that nothing is being shared between the practices at that point. And if they are, we have done many cases where we've gone in forensically and tried to separate them out. The lenders will do the same. And again, for every case that we have to do something like that and we don't have cleanliness, it breeds uncertainty and purchasers get anxious, lenders get anxious, and it makes it harder to value and it makes it harder to transition and especially uphold a stronger value. So again, the more that you can keep separate between multiple locations, the cleanliness that we can get in separate locations is vital to you in the case that you need to divest. And at some point, you probably are going to divest something. So just plan for that ahead. Again, we're all into planning. So that's where we're at. Spend your time up front and we can get it much easier towards the end.
Great. Well, I want to thank you guys, Greg and Chris. Wonderful job. And thanks for sharing your expertise and some of your experiences. And I hope that all the attendees were able to gather some good ideas. Maybe it really hit close to home with one of the examples that we went through. But you did a wonderful job. And now I'll give Chris and Greg a chance to have any last words.
Thanks, Tom. And, as you said in the beginning, Tom, one of the hardest parts about getting evaluation done is getting the information back. And Greg, what you said was, look at your lease. And what I was talking about is making sure that you know what insurances you're taking. So to wrap up, make sure that you actually take action. Make sure you understand your numbers and they make sense. Make sure that you're looking at your lease. So when you're looking to sell, at least you're ready for it and know whatever hurdles may come up. Maybe you can get rid of them or at least know what the challenges are. And then obviously at the end, make sure that you know that the insurance break that you have, because it's significant when somebody's looking to buy your practice. And I will let Greg wrap it up.
I was going to add, again, planning. Again, the earlier that you can start having these thoughts about where you're going to be down the road, and you may not pin it exactly correct, but we can at least plan for where you might want to be and where you might want to go, and get everything situated in a way that you're best situated to do what you want to do when you get there. The other component of that, though, is asking the questions and getting proper advice and help. These are things that we have all been through. All of these case studies are true, valid. They are real things that have happened, and they happen more often than you would probably think that they would happen. And it's these exact situations over and over and over again. But these are things that we've gone through multiple times at this point, and we have ways to work through, and we have the creative minds and the team to be able to put these together and say, how do we work through this situation? And, when you try to do this on your own and you try to go out there and try to evaluate and transition your practice without help, all of these pitfalls are out there to hit. And it's much harder to diagnose and know where they're going to be if you don't have someone who's potentially been there before. Just as though you would do in a study club or do in your own case studies and case work, trying to avoid that problem down the road comes from experience. And, having experience around can be invaluable in the case of a one-time transaction for you or a one-time valuation that leads to transaction for you, where just putting together on your own, you may be off base, or you may end up being in a pitfall that you just can't get yourself out of. So look, our goal here is to help. We want to kind of bring to light what's out here, because we've lived through it and we don't like living through it. But hopefully you were able to take something away and be able to ask the right questions going forward.
Finally, our website, henryscheindental.com/webinars. You can visit that and see some other programs that we presented over the years on various transition topics. So hopefully you'll get a chance to visit that. And finally, we covered a lot of ground and we could really address every particular issue that maybe you thought we would, given the content. So feel free to send any one of us an email. We have it listed here below, and we hope to hear from you. And we wish you all the most success in your practice and in your transition plans, and best of luck to all. Thank you very much for joining us.